Hello, I'm David Howell. I'm from the Center for Political Studies here at the University of Michigan. And I've really enjoyed all the presentations today. I'm also excited about the panel we have before us, which is Electoral Politics and Democratic Accountability. Our first presentation will be by Carlos Shenga from the University of Cape Town, presenting on the democratic quality of local elections in Mozambique.
Thank you, Dave. What I'm going to present is an assessment and is also a comparative study of democratic quality of local election in Mozambique. So the first local election in Mozambique was in 1998, and the last election was in 2008. So I'm going to compare since 1998 till 2008. The start of Mozambican election was pioneered by Luís de Brito when he analyzed voting behavior in Mozambique's first multi-party election in 1994. And so far, Mozambique has conducted 4 national regular elections. The first one was 1994, second 1999, and then 2004, and the last local national regular election was 2009. For each of these elections, there's at least one book being produced by Mozambican scholars or some articles. The problem of these studies that have been produced by Mozambican scholars when there's an election is that they focus on a single election rather than trying to compare the current election with the previous election. So what I'm going to try to do is to make a comparative study of Mozambican election and looking at the local election at subnational level. More specifically, I'm going to make an assessment and a comparison of democratic quality of local election by looking at political participation, political competition, and election legitimacy. On political participation, I'm going to look at the extent to which Mozambican participate in a local election, and also the extent to which political opposition participate in local election or they boycott election. On political competition, I'm going to analyze the extent to which local elections are competitive and also local elections lead to alternation of political power. And I define election competitiveness by the difference in percentage between the first and second most voted candidates. So if that difference is too high, means that elections are not competitive, and if the difference is too low, means that elections are competitive. On election legitimacy, I analyze the extent to which elections have been free and fair or have been flawed, whether losers accept election results, whether election process is peaceful or is violent, and by the end of the day, whether democratic regime survived at local level. And I analyze these 3 dimensions of democratic quality of election by looking, at the local level, and I use aggregated and official data from National Electoral Commission, which is the institution that supervises election in Mozambique, and also Constitutional Court, which is the institution that validates election. The quantity of local election. The first local election in Mozambique was 1998, so they were involved 33 municipalities. In 2003 was the second regular election, also involved 33 municipalities. But in 2008, there were 10 more additional municipalities, so there were 43 municipalities. Besides this local regular election in Mozambique, the government have been performing relatively well conducting by-election. For instance, in 2005, there was a by-election in Mocimboa da Praia municipality as a result of the death of Mocimboa da Praia mayor. In 2011, there was another by-election as a result of resignation of 3 mayors in the municipality of Kwamba, Quelimane, and Pemba. And also in 2012, there was a by-election in Inhambane municipality as a result of the death of the Inhambane mayor. And we are expecting next month to conduct the 4th local regular election, and this time we're going to add more 10 municipalities to make a total of 53 municipalities. In terms of results, first, on political participation, I'm going to try to bring data on the extent to which Mozambicans participate in election, but also the extent to which or opposition political parties participate. So this is aggregate result on voter turnout, and the result shows that of the 3 regular local regular election in Mozambique, which is represented in blue, the voter turnout is lowest in 1998 election, but there is a change over time. There's an improvement over time in 2003 and 2008. And on by-election, the result shows that voter turnout is lower in 2011, 20% compared with other by-election. So the interesting question that may be raised here is why voter turnout is lowest or is lower in 1998 election and 2011. The response is boycott. The opposition boycotted election in 1998, boycotted election in 2011. It boycotted also election in 2012, but 2012 doesn't apply so much for this explanation. So in 1998, the main opposition, Renamo, plus 10 other political parties, they boycotted the election, alleging that there were a lot of irregularities on voter registration. And the government received a lot of criticism from donor community, from civil society, and also from political parties that made the government to improve in terms of voter registration in the following election for 2003 and 2008. So that might explain the improvement of voter turnout in 2003 and 2008. And also the government made more mobilization, electoral mobilization through National Electoral Commission. To what extent opposition participate or boycott election in Mozambique at subnational level? So the red shows those elections that the opposition didn't participate in a local election. So that was in 1998, the main opposition plus 10 other political parties didn't participate, alleging that there were a lot of irregularities, so they didn't want to be part of the process. In 2011, by election, the main opposition didn't participate, so other small political parties participated, and the main opposition didn't participate, alleging that didn't see the reason of resignation of the mayor of 3 municipalities. In 2012, the main opposition didn't participate again, and this time they alleged that the victory for that municipality was already forecast for the ruling party, that because of having electoral system that, or electoral machinery that is very biased to the ruling party. Second, political competition. The result shows on election competitiveness shows that, as we can see here, the results show that Mozambican local elections are not competitive at all, because the difference in proportion between the first and second most voted candidate is too high. It's like the difference between the candidate that won election and the candidate that came second with most votes is too high. But if we compare, if you look at the municipal level, we can see that there are some municipalities that they have high level of competition. It's like municipality of Beira. In 2003, this municipality was taken by the opposition, so there was alternation of power. Nacala also, there was alternation of power, but in 2008 election, the ruling party took back Nacala municipality. The same happened in Angoche, Marumeu, and Ilha de Mozambique. So most of these municipalities, if we unpack by municipality, by 1998, 2003, and 2008 election, we can see the actual levels of competitiveness. Some, for instance, in 2008, the level of competition of municipality of Guru was less than 1%. So it's very competitive. So these are aggregate level data of election competitiveness. In terms of alternation of power, there was alternation of power in 2003 election in 5 municipalities. So the ruling party lost 5 municipalities, the municipality of Ilha de Mozambique, Nacala, Porto, Beira, Marumeu, and Angoche. But in 2008, the ruling party took back 4 of those 5 municipalities, with the exception of the municipality of Beira, where an independent candidate was able to defeat both the ruling party candidate and the main opposition candidate. In 2011, there was a by-election because of resignation of the mayor of Quelimane and other 3 mayors, but there was alternation only in Quelimane. MEDM, or an opposition candidate, was able to defeat the candidate of the ruling party. So these data suggest that the democratic quality of local election have been improving. So there's Mozambican election have been moving the country towards democratization because there's alternation of political power. It's very contested to measure democracy with alternation of political power, but it is one of the measures of democratization. Third, election legitimacy. To what extent Mozambican elections are free and fair, or they are flawed? In Mozambique, internal and external observers, electoral observers, have been saying that national election and even local election have been free and fair with major or minor problem. They do that by collecting data about electoral process, but they don't take into account electoral arrangement, like electoral institution that determine a lot in Mozambique election results. So in Mozambique, the composition of electoral commission and even constitutional court, which is the institution that validates election result, is biased to dominant part. So these 2 institutions are reflection of parliament. The way that the parliament is the way that these 2 institutions are. So the way that they function in favor of the ruling party. So my judgment is that elections in Mozambique are not free and fair, tend more to be flawed. Second, to what extent the election results are accepted by the losing candidates? Well, in 2003, when the ruling party lost 5 municipalities, the ruling party accepted the results. But in 2008, when the opposition lost those 4 in favor of ruling party, the opposition did not accept the results and demanded more representation in electoral commission. So the opposition said that the electoral arrangement are not free and fair. Is the Mozambican electoral process peaceful, violent? Not always. Violent conflict have been sometimes part of Mozambican electoral process. For instance, in stronghold municipalities like the municipality of Shokwe and the municipality of Xai-Xai, which is stronghold of the ruling party, the ruling party support have not been accepting the opposition supporter to come and campaign. They are either receiving by stones, they see their local headquarters vandalized, destroyed, or even in fire. But competitive municipalities tend also to be violent. For instance, the municipality of Mocimboa da Praia, which is very competitive, or was very competitive in the 2005 by-election, there was also attacks. The democratic regime survived after all these 6 regular local election and by-election? The response is yes. Municipal government have been working relatively well, delivering service, delivering goods to Mozambican public. But between election, the opposition party tend mainly to not exist, to not show up, to not show off. And the same applies to Mozambican people. When Afrobarometer interviewers ask Mozambicans whether they participate between elections, whether they contact officials between 2 elections, there's about 70 to 90% that they never did that. In terms of summary, on political participation, voter turnout is very low in Mozambique, but there's a progressive change in people's participation in election, and voter turnout tended to be lower when the opposition boycott election. On political participation, election competitiveness is low, but this is my forecast. What I forecast for the November 2013 local election is that the opposition will likely to win between 3 to 5 or even 6 municipalities. So there will be more alternation of political power. So far, the opposition is controlling 2 municipalities in Mozambique, municipality of Beira and the municipality of Quelimane. And besides those 2, it's possible that opposition will take 3 more. Election legitimacy. There's not so much legitimacy on Mozambican local election. I think that they are flawed. That is my judgment. Losers accept results, but the opposition demand more representation in electoral institutions. Elections have been violent in some municipalities, even though in others have been more peaceful, and the democratic regime have survived. In terms of conclusion, I would say that the democratic quality of Mozambican local election is low, but there is evidence that these local elections, have been moving Mozambique toward democratization because there is an alternation of political power. And this happened in a context that the ruling party control all electoral institutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Carlos. Our second presenter today is Blessings Chinsinga from the University of Malawi. He'll be presenting Transition Without Transformation, the Political Economy of 2 Decades of Multi-Party Elections in Malawi.
Yeah, my presentation is on Transition Without Transformation, the Political Economy of 2 Decades of Multi-Party Elections in Malawi. This is how I'm going to proceed. I'll begin by briefly stating the introduction, and then look at the theoretical and methodological context, and then look at the findings and make some concluding remarks. Basically, what I'm doing in this presentation is to try to examine the political economy of 2 decades of multi-party elections in Malawi, inspired by the fact that since the transition to democracy in May 1994, we'll be holding the 5th consecutive elections in May next year. And in particular, I've been inspired by the 2 consecutive elections test that says countries that have at least done 2 consecutive multi-party general elections are better positioned to begin to consolidate their democracy. Although I think it must be acknowledged that the concept of democracy consolidation itself is under serious contention, because the democracy consolidation implies that the democratization process comes to an end point, which is not necessarily the case. I think democracy consolidation, democratization should be understood as an ongoing process. And I think the current shutdown in this country really demonstrates that we cannot talk of mature democracies, because I think this is an ongoing process. But that said, what I try to do in this paper is to try to understand the political economy of elections in Malawi by undertaking a critical analysis of election observation mission reports. And as I said, as a country, we have had 4 consecutive general elections, beginning in 1994, 1999, 2004, and 2009. Basically, there is a justification for having election observation missions. The argument really is that these election observation missions do play a critical role in ensuring that elections are free and fair. These election observation missions do play a critical role in preventing fraud and irregularities. Of course, there is a debate as to whether local or international election observation missions are better insofar as the question of contributing positively to improvement of the democratization process is concerned. Of course, the argument against the international election observation missions is that these are people who fly in maybe 2 weeks before the elections and make their observations, and they leave almost immediately after the results have been declared. And therefore, there is very little that they can do in order to enforce the process of beginning to make the necessary changes on the basis of the recommendations made. On the other hand, local election observation missions are carried out by people that are resident in a country, and therefore they would really be in a position to begin to engage with the stakeholders with the view of really making sure that the changes proposed are taken into account. But regardless of this debate, I think the most important point really is that we cannot understand the quality of elections outside the context in which they take place. So we really need to understand the political, the cultural, and the historical context in which elections are taking place, because those have a significant impact in terms of determining whether the elections are really free and fair. Now, basis of the review that we carried out, we discovered that the election observation missions, whether local or international, have had almost the same verdict across the 4 elections. And basically, the election observation missions have declared the elections as being free, but not fair. And when we look at the election observation mission reports, the very same set of problems and challenges are repeated almost election after election. So how did we go about trying to carry out this analysis? We did use an institutional approach from a political economy perspective. Basically, I think most of us do understand institutions as the rules of the game. And from a democratization perspective, basically, an institutional approach means that once a country embarks on a transitional process, it begins to put institutions that would make the country function as a democracy. And the emphasis is on making sure that those institutions that are put in place, like free press, independent judiciary, do function accordingly. But within this context, political economy is understood as the interaction between economic and political processes, particularly in terms of how they impede or support the resolution of collective action problems. Because basically, when we are looking at a country making progress or a society making progress, it is very much dependent on how that particular country is able to overcome collective action problems. But in particular, I think our interest in using the political economy approach was to understand how the interaction between economic and the political processes do drive political behavior, and how this shapes particular policies and programs, and who are the main winners and main losers, and what are the implications for development strategies and programs. So the assumption in relation to the electoral process is that the process, the quality of the process is going to improve as time goes on, because the voters, the administrators, the key stakeholders in the electoral process will get used to the process and adjust accordingly. And in this case, it means that the democratic political culture will be maturing over time, which implies that if indeed that was the case in the Malawi context, then the 2009 elections should have been the most well managed, because the key stakeholders would have at least internalized the democratic tradition, practices, and the culture. But I think the value addition of political economy is that it brings to our attention that these processes of change are not neutral. Whenever changes are taking place, there will be winners and losers. And naturally, losers would want to fight the state, losers would want to change the status quo, whereas winners would want to maintain the status quo. And that, I think, as we shall later on show, is what has made change almost impossible in the context of Malawi's election. So ultimately, what this means is that the process of change are often heavily contested interests with forms and degrees of power, influence, authority, winners and the losers. Now, when we were doing the assessment, we tried to pick up some benchmarks that election observers use. These benchmarks are international and regional. And in this presentation, I'm giving out examples of the regional benchmarks that have been used in trying to evaluate the quality of the electoral processes in Malawi. For instance, we have had the AU observers using the African Union Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, the Southern African Development Community Principles and Guidelines governing elections, the Southern Africa Development Community Parliamentary Forums, Norms and Standards for Elections, and the Electoral Institute of Southern Africa Principles for Elections and the Elections Management, Monitoring and Observation. And when we reviewed these election observation mission reports for the period of 20 years, we discovered that there are huge commonalities on the areas that they do focus on. For instance, they focus on constitutional and legal framework, management of electoral processes, media access coverage, voter registration and voters' roll, polling, voting, counting and results management, use of public resources, voter education and information, and conflict resolution mechanisms. And what did we find? I think the most interesting for me is that almost all the election observer mission reports are essentially a carbon copy of each other across the elections, but also across the election observer missions. They raise the same things over and over again, and I think, in my view, they very much pass the paste and copy test. For instance, I think I was reading at the 2009 election, EU election observation mission report and compare it to the 2001. I think it was almost similar word for word, except for the dates and the composition of the teams. Otherwise, the very same issues that were raised in 2004 were repeated almost wholesale in 2009. So what it means is that regardless of having election observation missions across all these 4 elections, as a country, we have not done any learning from our previous mistakes, our previous experiences. And what is very striking is that the opposition are all often vocal about making sure that the recommendations are implemented. But we have had at least 2 changes of government. The opposition coming into power, although it has not necessarily been through the ballot. But once they get into, they get at the helm of government, they are very reluctant to push for the reforms. And basically, they are hesitant because the logical conclusion of the reforms would really undermine their prospects of retaining power. Because what it would mean is that if the reforms are implemented, then that would make the level the playing field level, and that would increase the chances of their opponents assuming power. And I would like just to illustrate by looking at 2 or 3 areas that are looked at by the election observation missions, starting with the legal framework, the constitutional legal framework. And in this case, we are looking at 2 issues: the nature of the electoral system. I think each and every election observation mission has highlighted that the electoral system is not fair. And I think as a country, we use the simple majoritarian electoral system. And they have recommended at least a transition to some kind of proportional representation. And in addition to the election observation missions, we have had 2 comprehensive constitutional reviews. And these have recommended a similar transition. But the ultimate responsibility rests with Parliament. And these recommendations have never been debated in Parliament, because both the opposition and the governing parties have an interest in retaining the status quo. Then there is the question with the Electoral Commission. There are issues with the composition, the procedures of appointing commissioners, and the reporting and funding modalities. In fact, I think the problem is as in Mozambique, because the responsibility of appointing electoral commissioners rests with the president. And he has to appoint the commissioners in consultation with the parties represented in parliament. And basically, it means that if the president's party is not strong in parliament, then they circumvent the procedures in order to make sure that they compete the elections under favorable conditions. So ultimately, our argument is that all this reflects the nature of our political culture as a country. It is characterized by patronage, clientelism, corruption, opportunism, and most importantly, gender discrimination. And then when we look at the management of the electoral processes, certainly the expectation is that the election management body would ensure that electoral justice prevails at each and every stage of the electoral process. But the election observation mission reports have constantly characterized our electoral commission as being partial. And there are some interesting decisions that the electoral commission has made that clearly demonstrate that it's not an impartial body. For instance, in 1998, they made a proposal to increase the number of parliamentary seats from 177 to 242. And about 80% of those seats were in a region believed to be a stronghold for the ruling party. So basically, if it went through, it would have been outright rigging. And in 2009 elections, the then president was allowed to change his name on the ballot paper way after the nomination period. Initially, he had presented himself as Mutarika, and he changed to Bingu, because then that meant that he would come first on the ballot paper. And studies have shown that the position on the ballot paper creates some kind of advantages. And this was really allowed. And then the Electoral Commission unilaterally changed the participation fees. In this case, of course, these are Malawi kwachas, from 5,000 to 100,000 for parliament, and from 50,000 to 500,000 for the presidential elections. And what happened? All candidates for the ruling party were paid for by the party. And basically that meant, I think, others had to struggle, because these, by Malawian standards, are not small amounts of money. And the Electoral Commission has consistently failed to act on blatant, I think, violations of the Electoral Code, election after election. And finally, there is the question of the voters' registration and voters' roll. I think this is an issue that has been consistently highlighted election after election. And what I do there is pointing out some of the key challenges that have really been a recurrent concern. But what is important to note in this context is that election after election, the idea of overhauling the voters' registration is always high on the agenda. But come the next election, nothing really happens. We find ourselves in the very same problems. For instance, in 2004, the Electoral Commission have registered 6.7 million voters, when all the projections showed that the maximum we could have was 5.7 million voters. So there was an excess of 1 million voters. And this had to be resolved with the intervention of a South African IT firm. Otherwise, it could have stood. So, in terms of concluding, I think it's very clear from the reports that we have reviewed that Malawi's elections since 1994 have consistently been declared free, but not necessarily fair. And when we look at the challenges that come up election after election, they're essentially the same. And basically, what it means is that we haven't learned from our own experience. And in most cases, I think the implication is that if the reforms recommended by the election observation missions were to be implemented, then it could create winners and losers. And in this case, losers would be those who would have just won the elections. And they make sure that those reforms are not implemented at all. But what is very interesting is that in most cases, both the opposition and the party in government are very reluctant to push for the reforms. For the opposition, they have a feeling that if they make the reforms, then they will be hanging themselves should they find themselves at the helm of government, whether by hook or crook. So the argument in most cases has been that as a country, maybe we can improve our electoral processes by adopting an electoral cycle approach, which would ensure that there is activity taking place in between elections in order not to treat elections as an event, but as a process. But the major challenge is that the Electoral Commission depends on funding from government. And the government releases funding only if the activities that are going to be done are not threatening in any way to its potential hold on to power. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blessings. Our third presentation today is by Oloo from the University of Nairobi. He'll be presenting Marginalization in Kenya, Redressing Historical Injustices Through Affirmative Action and Devolution.
Okay, thank you very much. As you can see, my presentation is on marginalization in Kenya, redressing historical injustices through affirmative action and devolution. And basically, as an introduction, I'm noting that marginalization is a very emotive subject in Kenya, although its precise meaning is not even agreed upon. So as a working definition, I decided to say it includes exclusion, underdevelopment, or alienation of certain ethnic groups or social cleavage. The whole reason for me saying that is that if you go to developed countries, then you'll find that politics is decided most of the time, either by ideology, either by issues, and so on. If you go to most developing countries, Kenya included, then you find that it is identity that determines how politics is organized and how access to state power is achieved. Therefore, against this background, the marginalized in Kenya include women, youth, persons living with disabilities, as well as ethnic and racial minorities. And you'll find that the aforementioned groups have since the colonial era been marginalized in what has been called in Kenya historical injustices, that you go back to the colonial times and the successive governments that have come into place have continued on the same path. And the reason why we are talking about marginalization is because of distributive and redistributive politics. So those who are political scientists will know the definition of Harold Laswell or David Easton, that politics is basically who gets what, when, and how, or the authoritative allocation of resources and values. And if you go to Kenya, then you'll find that most of the time we have what political scientists have called patron-client relationship, insofar as redistributive policies or distributive policies are concerned. And the patron in this case is usually the president of the country, and the client, most of the time, is the ethnic group or the coalition of ethnic groups that deal with that. And this has also been entrenched, surprisingly, in the policies that Kenya has adopted. If you look at Kenya, then the political and economic blueprint that has determined resource allocation and development in Kenya is what is called Sessional Paper Number 10 of 1965. And basically, it was dubbed African Socialism and its application to planning in Kenya. Leave the name aside. If you read that document, it was a capitalist document. And what that document said was that resources, in order to spur economic development, would be confined to the so-called high potential areas, the so-called productive areas. And that borrowed from the colonial times, because when the colonialists, the British colonialists were in Kenya, one of their way of penetrating into the interior and therefore extracting resources from the country was to build a railway line. And it's that railway line that decided which were the high potential areas. The railway line passed through them. And the non-potential areas, in this case, did not see the railway line. Successive governments ensured that, so that if you go to Kenya today, not only the railway line, but the roads infrastructure, whether electricity, whether roads, whether water, you'll find them concentrated in the so-called high potential areas, while the non-potential areas don't have such an infrastructure, and neither does it have the social amenities. So how can you categorize marginalization in Kenya? Number one, as I have inferred, is on regions, that there are a lot of regional imbalances and inequality. For example, I can just pick one from my paper, is that Kenya has 42 ethnic groups, but only 20 out of the 40 listed Kenyan communities are statistically visible in the civil service, in the bureaucracy, to the extent that the other 20 don't have even 1% of their population in the civil service. If I was to go to what Shenga and my brother from Malawi have talked about in elections in Kenya, it can only potentially be won by the so-called big five. That is the 5 big ethnic groups, who constitute 70% of the population. And the rest, 37, constitute 30% of the population. And if you look at Kenya, which has now been independent for 50 years, it has been ruled by 4 presidents who have come from only 2 communities. They have rotated because they have the numbers. The one which has the highest population at 21%, the Kikuyu, have produced a president 3 times. The number 3 in terms of population, which is Kalenjin, has produced a president 1 time. And there is no likelihood, if we go by the majoritarian system, that the other 37 tribes will ever have a chance of getting to the presidency, because people don't vote on issues, they don't vote on ideology, they vote on identity. Are you one of our own? And therefore, to that extent, that's how they get to power. The other marginalized group, of course, because of the patriarchal nature of Kenya and most African societies, is women, who remain marginally represented in both the public and private spheres. And therefore, if you look at the body politic and even the administrative structures of Kenya, then you'll always find women at the lower level. But surprisingly, you might want to know that women form around 50.6% of the population. So they are slightly have a higher number than the men. So you would ask me, how come they don't vote their own? But you know, all of you, that because of the patriarchal nature, most women were left behind in terms of education, and therefore they are trying to catch up now through affirmative action, but their thinking is still that they listen to the men. So even as we go to the ballot booths, they vote where their husbands tell them to vote. And therefore, if you leave it to them to determine their own destiny, then that will not come to fruition. The other group that you can say is marginalized because it is now, they comprise more than 60% of the population are the youth. And in Kenya, in the Constitution, we define a youth as somebody who is between the age of 18 and the age of 35. And majority remain largely unemployed, as well as being in the margins of the political spheres. In fact, the joke in Kenya is always to tell the youth, you are the leaders of tomorrow. And they keep on wondering, when will that tomorrow come? When these others. Another category that is marginalized in Kenya is the disabled group. And that is because we don't have any affirmative action, or before we didn't try to do that. It is against this background that when Kenyans demanded for a new constitution, which they had demanded from 1991. They got one in 2010. This constitution tried to redress some of the marginalization that we have been talking about. And although there is a prescription how to address this marginalization, as I shall demonstrate, it is not a guarantee that those injustices will be redressed. So the first route that the Constitution uses to redress some of these marginalizations is through affirmative action. So for example, I'm giving there that Article 27.6 creates a duty of affirmative action, and Article 27.1 says, every individual's right to equal protection and equal benefit from the law must be guaranteed. Again, a flat statement, because you are basically saying that it is an ideal, it is a principle, you are not stating how it will ensure that. But one of which is supposed to be pragmatic is Article 132, which says the composition of the national executive shall reflect the regional and ethnic diversity of the people of Kenya. But again, it doesn't specify the numbers. I can give you an example. Right now, after our elections in March 2013, the president of Kenya pegged the number of cabinet secretaries at 18. Out of those 18, more than half are from the president and deputy president's community. So if you ask them, they say that at least we have included some who are not from our community. But you can see again that the Constitution leaves room for a president not to address those issues. The other issue that has been provides, Article 55 provides further protection for minorities and marginalized groups. But again, you'll find that those provisions that are in the Constitution, some are not implementable. I can give you an example. One of the clauses in the Constitution says that all elective and public offices shall constitute not more than 2/3 of either gender. Yeah, half a minute. Either gender. Yet, we know that election is an open process. The Constitution only guarantees women 47 seats out of a 349 parliament, both National Assembly and the Senate. But it doesn't say how women will form that 1/3. And therefore, the issue went to the Supreme Court that suppose you don't meet the threshold of 1/3, will you declare that parliament unconstitutional? And the Supreme Court ruled that that clause in the Constitution was supposed to be achieved progressively, not immediately. So that is still an issue in the country. Of course, on women, I've already said that is a problem. In terms of the youth, again, they are just token provisions, which says that, for example, the state shall take measures, including affirmative action, to ensure that youth access relevant education and training. Again, a flat provision, which doesn't tell you the how that it will be implemented. The disabled, again, you find that there are provisions in the Constitution, for example, guaranteeing that in the nomination of members of parliament, at least they have 1 seat for either female and male. So again, it's just a token. But the major area in which Kenya has tried to address marginalization for ethnic groups, in fact, is through what we call in Kenya devolution. So that in Kenya now, we have 47 counties, which each has a governor and has a legislature. And the Constitution states that not less than 15% of national consolidated revenue shall go to those counties. So basically what Kenyans were saying is that we have been ruled through a very centralized system in which those who are in power deny certain regions, deny certain countries the necessary resources to spur development, and therefore we are going to include it in the Constitution. The Constitution also provides for what it calls an equalization fund for those marginalized areas, of which 0.5% of the consolidated fund shall accrue. So you find that in order to address marginalization, the Constitution has tried to use affirmative action and to use devolution. Whether this will ensure that the country catches up is another question altogether. So how do I conclude? I conclude by saying that the Constitution has provided a building block to address marginalizations, but the policies which have been developed do not give expression to the intent of the Constitution. I'm saying they have missed the point, because giving marginalized area a certain percentage of money shall not lead to a solution. Remember, these particular counties don't have the necessary infrastructure. They don't have electricity in homes. They don't have water taps in their homes. And they don't have social amenities, including schools, including hospitals, and so on. The fact that you have given them some handout from the national government is not going to create that necessary infrastructure that can spur development over time. And my suggestion is that in addition to that not less than 15% which shall be redistributed amongst the 47 counties, the national government must come up with a master plan in which to empower the capacity of those other counties that have always remained behind. Remember, even in terms of professionalism, those who have the know-how will not go to work in those counties which have remained behind, because where will they take their children? To which schools? To which hospitals? There'll be nothing which will attract them to those marginalized countries that have always remained behind. And therefore, they'll want either to work in the urban areas or in those counties which have been developed, and therefore the necessary personnel that is supposed to spur development will be missing from those marginalized areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Adams. The final presentation of the panel today will be Gilbert Khadiagala from WITS. He's going to present Disciplining the Electorate, the International Criminal Court in Kenya's 2013 elections.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and thank you for staying behind and staying awake. I want to thank Anne, Dave, and Kelly. I'm very new to this intellectual community, and so I'm very excited to be here. I promised Dave that I'll use less than 15 of my minutes. And the point is very simple. I have only 5 slides. What I want to do in looking at the ICC in the recent Kenyan election is essentially to structure the discussion around those 4 issues there. What is the focus of my paper? What is the puzzle that I'm putting to the table? And some answers to that puzzle. And then I have a very short storyline, and then the conclusion. The focus is what I'm calling 2 indictments. Indictments that one is more recent. In fact, one is really the focus of the paper. The indictment of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto by the ICC. And this is what, in fact, galvanized a lot of national debate about the role of international actors. And I think the conclusion, most of us, I think, know that, in fact, that those indictments helped the true principles, in fact, to win the 2013 elections. So that is the more current story. But I think the bigger indictment that I'm interested in is a more historical indictment about the role of external actors in the democratization process in Kenya. And I think that is the more profound and the more interesting issue because it raises really profound questions about the issue about the contestation between local and international norms. The bigger contest about electability, about responsibility, but also about good political behavior. And so the question I'm asking, therefore, is when and how do those local and international values clash? And when they clash, who actually wins? The puzzle, therefore, is there has been a very profound role of donors in the Kenyan democratization process since 1991. Donors were celebrated, were lauded for their contribution to debates about political change. The more interesting question, therefore, is how do we move from this kind of celebratory, laudatory era of external engagement to the current one, if we are using the ICC and the indictment of Uhuru and Ruto, how did we come to the stage of vilification and denunciation of the very same external actors? So I think that's a good question to ask. How did we come to this, the current context? Secondly, I think the issue about how did we arrive at a situation where from rogue ambassadors who are hand-holding elites for a long time, over a 20-year period, the tolerance, elite tolerance of hand-holding by external actors has now, in fact, come about to be essentially the question of the same elites beginning to reclaim sovereignty, beginning to reclaim national dignity. So there is something there that we need to explain, the transition from good rogue ambassadors to bad rogue ambassadors, if we could use that term. And I'm arguing here that, in fact, the Kenyan situation is not very unique. We just saw very recently Gambia, a very poor, very desolate country, moving out of the Commonwealth and saying we want to reclaim our sovereignty. We don't want donors on our backs anymore. And I think the story on the ICC in the Kenyan context, therefore, illustrates that kind of broader trend of reclamation of sovereignty. What are some of the answers, I think, to the current context where the donors, external actors are vilified and denounced for stepping on the toes of national elites? And I like the notion that was established earlier by Rita Abramson, who is talking about how the third wave of democratization in Africa was essentially attempts by external actors to discipline local actors. She calls it disciplining of democracy. And I think that's a very interesting element to look at, therefore, what I'm calling the disproportionate role of external actors in Africa's third wave of democratization. And so one of the explanations for the current context is essentially what I'm calling a backlash. There is a backlash against external intrusiveness in the processes of political change. And I'm arguing in the paper, therefore, that the Kenyan story around the ICC is the beginnings, probably, of the attempts for these elites to begin to say, enough is enough. Let's do our own thing. And I'm just teasing it out as a thesis here. The more interesting thing, therefore, is that neither the elites nor the masses are no longer interested in the disciplinary strictures that accrue from international norms. And I think this is a big backlash we are seeing around the ICC. They have been disciplining them and are now saying, no, we've now matured. And it's an interesting element, an interesting point to tease in the Kenyan context. But I'm also arguing that the processes that we are describing over the Kenyan, the Malawian context are revealing that, in fact, external actors in their democracy promotion efforts have never succeeded in redressing very profound power imbalances in these countries. And therefore, what we have is essentially a context of what I'm calling democratization on the cheap. Democratization on the cheap that has really that has postponed real local experiments with alliances that function, with elites that can now speak to each other, reinforcing the old argument that there are limits, in fact, to democratization from without. And so my argument is that over the 20 or so years of Kenya's democratization, there has been a failure at the democracy project that is disciplined from without. And that's really the key message I'm putting in this paper. So what is the storyline? And this is a very simple. From 1990, you have one step forward, two steps backwards. Donors push Mr. Moi to democratize, introduce political parties, but Mr. Moi, again, plays a very good cat and mouse game with donors. Through the so-called democratization, in fact, there is an entrenchment of authoritarian practices until 2002, when Moi is defeated through the alliance that I'm calling the NAC coalition, which is a very interesting coalition in Kenyan context, because I'm arguing therefore that when you had elites coalescing around a national project, there was an opportunity for external actors to stay away, at least temporarily. It was an interesting moment of elite coalescence that kept donors at bay. However, this coalition collapsed very quickly, and that collapse is also instructive in understanding whether in fact you're going to have steady or stable alliances within the Kenyan context. Because it's only those stable alliances that are actually going to keep outsiders out. But if you don't have those alliances that actually can endure, you always have external actors essentially running the process. So we have another important event, which is a constitutional referendum in 2005 that Adams has been talking about. And the referendum was important because it was heavily contested. There was a lot of ethnic aggregation around that constitution. And I'm arguing that the 2005 constitution was a precursor to the violence that we saw in 2007. And this is where, in fact, we saw genocide, according to the ICC now, Ruto and Kenyatta implicated in that violence in 2007. I'm ending my story. What did the 20 elections demonstrate? I think the key element here is that the ICC has been in Kenya, was invited in Kenya via the Kofi Annan mediation process. So that's the first component. But the second component, of course, is that Kenya signed up to these international norms in 2005. So it's a signatory to the ICC. So we should not contest why the ICC is there. But in 2000, this year, elections, the ICC became a villain for encroaching on Kenya's sovereignty, or that elites mobilized that element of reclamation of sovereignty in order to embarrass the ICC. Another important element in this election was donors essentially coming out very clearly and making threats to the electorate, saying, don't elect these two people who have been indicted, because if you do that, there are going to be sanctions, there are going to be consequences. And it's that kind of national discourse around electability that in fact reverberates. The electorate says, you know, we don't want to be disciplined anymore. Or at least the elites using all kinds of mobilization tools are latching onto that issue. We don't need external discipline. And that's why I'm saying, therefore, donors' entreaties failed to influence the electorate. But the story continues. It hasn't ended. The two are in power. The trials are ongoing against the very organized assault on the ICC by the AU. I think there is a meeting in Addis Ababa now on trying to decide on whether Africa should essentially pull out. Using the Kenyan cases, that external actors have been disproportionately influencing our events, we should now mobilize against the ICC internationally and get the African countries who are signatories to move out. Where is the conclusion, therefore? If you read the paper, you'll see that I'm raising questions at the end that says, is its process sustainable? That means, is the alliance that was created against the external actors, against the ICC, is this kind of alliance potentially going to lay the foundations for more stable political order, a more stable political context in which now elites can argue within themselves, they can negotiate, they can talk about themselves without the hand-holding of donors or external actors? So that's an interesting issue to pose, because if this alliance or this negative alliance around the ICC survives, one probably could be thinking about how you then begin to have local elites building their own local institutions anchored in national processes, if it survives. The second question, therefore, is, can the newfound nationalism, because there's a lot of debate about the Kenyan nation, how mature it is, how they don't want anybody to tell them how to run their country. Can this newfound nationalism sufficiently insulate the country from external donor promotion efforts? So those two questions are really, really questions in progress that we need to tease out as the story unfolds further. And these are some of the questions my paper, when I revise it, will be actually coming out more clearly with some answers. Thank you very much.